Part 1. The Party Before the Fall. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine waking up in 1922. The war is over. The boys are home. And somewhere across town, a jazz band is already playing. Loud, joyful, impossibly alive. World War I had ended just a few years before, and America exhaled. Women had entered the workforce for the first time. Men returned home with fire in their eyes, and together they built something magnificent. Factories that once forged weapons now churned out toasters, vacuum cleaners, and refrigerators. Henry Ford's moving assembly line turned a 12-hour build into 90 minutes flat, dropping the price of a car from $780 to $290, putting the open road within reach of ordinary people. By 1927, 15 million Model Ts had rolled off that line. This was the Roaring Twenties, and it roared. Cities shot skyward, jazz poured out of every window, 10 million homes hummed with radio sets. The country's wealth more than doubled. Prohibition started in 1920, but it meant little to this new generation. The parties were bigger, the morals were looser, and the spirit of the age was simple: more. And nowhere was that spirit more intoxicating than Wall Street. The stock market became Disneyland for adults. From 1921 to 1929, it increased sixfold. Margin loans let anyone buy $100 of stock with just $10 down. Whether you were a railroad tycoon or the man who shined shoes outside the exchange, you put your money in. Even the barber knew. Trust me, kid, utilities are hot. I made a killing in stocks. You're still a barber, though. Yes, but spiritually, I'm a tycoon. Banks gave out loans like money grew on trees. Everyone was borrowing. Borrowing to buy radios, borrowing to buy cars, borrowing to buy more stocks. By 1929, 40% of all consumer debt in America was being used to purchase stocks. People believed, with a kind of beautiful madness, that prices only went up. President Herbert Hoover said it plainly. We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. But behind all that champagne and jazz, something wasn't right. Farmers had been struggling since the mid-20s, squeezed by falling prices and rising debt. Global trade was stalling as Europe crawled out of the wreckage of war. Stock prices had broken free from gravity, untethered from real company profits, floating on nothing but optimism. A few voices tried to sound the alarm. Economist Roger Babson warned in 1929, "A crash is coming." Wall Street responded by buying more stock and telling Roger to go touch grass. And the jazz played on. Part 2. The Day America Fell. Then came the morning of October 24th, 1929. Picture the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. People screaming into telephones, papers flying through the air like snow. Two men run directly into each other. Sales orders and memos scatter, drifting gently to the ground, only to be trampled a moment later by businessmen running for the doors. "All is lost!" someone shouts. "This is the end!" a banker cries from the middle of the stampede. Black Thursday had arrived. That day alone, a record 12.9 million shares were sold. The market fell 11% in a single afternoon. The following week brought Black Tuesday, an even darker day, with the market falling another 12% and 16.4 million shares changing hands in a frenzy of desperation. In the span of 2 weeks, stocks had lost a third of their value. $14 billion. Gone. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $200 billion. Not monopoly money, real homes, real savings, real futures, vanished overnight. Outside the exchange, crowds gathered in stunned silence. Some held hands. Some wept. Others simply stared at the pavement, trying to understand how an entire economy had tripped over its own shoelaces. The Roaring Twenties hadn't just ended, they had face-planted into a brick wall while carrying everyone's retirement. And it was only the beginning. The crash triggered a chain reaction. First came the margin calls. Those loans that had felt so clever now came due all at once. Investors scrambled to repay money they no longer had. Paper fortunes disappeared overnight. People who had been wealthy on Monday were bankrupt by Thursday. Then came the banks, those grand marble institutions, pillars of trust, oak desks, serious men in serious suits, turned out to be built on worthless paper and blind optimism. As the market imploded, they couldn't recover their loans. So they did what failing things do. They collapsed. And the people ran. Not jogged, ran. Bank runs broke out across the country. Crowds surged outside branch doors, banging and screaming for their savings. In New York City, a single false rumor that one bank had refused to sell a man's stock was enough to bring 25,000 people flooding to its doors. By the end of the day, $3 million had been withdrawn. The bank closed. Then it failed entirely. 1/3 of all banks in America would ultimately collapse in this period. With people pulling their money out and hiding it under mattresses, the money supply in the United States shrank by 31% between 1929 and 1933. And deflation is a quiet killer. When money becomes more valuable sitting still, no one spends it. Wages fall, businesses close, and the cycle feeds itself, deeper and darker, like a whirlpool pulling everything down. Through all of it, the Federal Reserve stood back. No intervention, no rescue. A silence that economists would criticize for decades to come. And President Hoover? He appeared on radio broadcasts, calm as ever, assuring Americans that the economy is fundamentally sound. Millions sat at empty dinner tables and wondered which part of that sentence was supposed to help them. The crash wasn't the bottom. It was just the beginning. And what waited below, that's where things get dark. Part 3. A Nation on its Knees. By 1931, the music was gone. The lights were off. The party was over. And what followed wasn't silence. It was the sound of factories grinding to a halt. Of fathers whispering apologies they never thought they'd have to say. Unemployment soared to nearly 25%. 1 in every 4 Americans who wanted to work couldn't find any. Detroit, once the industrial crown jewel of the nation, watched its auto plants shutter one by one. Production collapsed by 75%. The great machines stopped turning. And the men who had once assembled the American dream stood outside factory gates, waiting. For what? They didn't know. Bread lines stretched for city blocks. Mothers lined up at dawn for a bowl of thin soup. Children watched, too young to understand why breakfast had become a luxury. Teachers reported students fainting in classrooms, not from boredom, but from hunger. They hadn't eaten in days. In total, 9 million savings accounts were wiped out. Over 9,000 banks had failed. 34 million Americans had no income at all. Shanty towns sprang up across the country. Ramshackle cities of scrap and cardboard, bitterly nicknamed Hoovervilles after the president who seemed not to see them. Hoover blankets, people called the newspapers they used for warmth. Hoover flags, empty pockets turned inside out. And then the sky turned black. In the Great Plains, years of aggressive farming had stripped the land bare. When the rains stopped coming, the soil cracked. And the winds came, towering, choking dust storms that swept across the heartland, blotting out the sun. They called them black blizzards. Crops were buried. Livestock suffocated. Families coughed through the nights and woke up coated in the same earth that used to feed them. This was the Dust Bowl, the worst man-made ecological disaster in American history. Millions fled Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, packing everything they owned into broken-down cars, driving west on rumors of jobs and land that hadn't yet turned to sand. California or bust. the signs read. For many, it was just bust. Not everyone suffered equally. Black Americans faced a cruelty layered on top of the cruelty everyone else endured. Farm and manual labour jobs had no wage minimums, so employers could drop pay to unlivable levels, and did. Relief packages from the government were distributed unequally, with black communities routinely denied what white communities received. And yet, amidst this double injustice, a remarkable woman named Mary McLeod Bethune rose. As FDR's Director of Negro Affairs for the National Youth Administration, she ensured that every New Deal agency had a black advisor. The number of African Americans working in government tripled under her leadership. Civil rights had a long road ahead, but she walked it fiercely. Meanwhile, in the summer of 1932, something broke. Thousands of World War I veterans, desperate and forgotten, marched peacefully to Washington. They had been promised bonuses for their service, bonuses not due for years, but they needed them now. They built a tent city outside the Capitol and waited. Congress said no, Hoover said no, and then the army came. Tear gas was fired, camps were burned, families fled into the smoke. The government had turned its weapons on its own heroes. America wasn't just broke, it was broken. Part 4. Hope in the Rubble. And then, in November 1932, America made a choice. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president on a promise, not of comfort, but of action, of change so drastic it had a name, the New Deal. On Inauguration Day in March 1933, millions leaned in close to their radios as FDR's voice came through the static. "The only thing we have to fear," he said, "is fear itself." It was more than a speech. It was the first deep breath the country had taken in years. Roosevelt didn't wait. Within weeks, young men in threadbare clothes were handed shovels and a sense of purpose. The Civilian Conservation Corps sent them into forests and parks, planting trees, building trails. The Works Progress Administration put millions more to work constructing roads, bridges, schools, and post offices. They didn't just rebuild infrastructure, they rebuilt pride. People who had stood in bread lines now stood on scaffolding, raising steel into the sky. In the Tennessee Valley, the TVA built dams and strung electricity through towns that had lived in darkness for generations. Families gathered around radios, not because they could finally afford one, but because, for the first time, they had power to plug one in. Lights flickered on. Life stirred. But FDR didn't stop at putting people to work. He wanted to fix the machine, not just oil it. He established the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, to keep Wall Street honest and transparent. He created the FDIC, Federal Insurance on Bank Deposits, so that if a bank ever fell again, the people who trusted it wouldn't lose everything. Banks reopened, and this time people weren't running in to withdraw in panic. They were depositing, quietly, hopefully. He signed in Social Security. It didn't make anyone rich. It didn't need to. It simply said, "You matter. We'll remember you. You won't have to work until you collapse." It was quiet. It was monumental. He set a minimum wage, established overtime pay and unemployment insurance. For the first time, a safety net existed for ordinary Americans. Even the arts got a job. The Federal Arts Project paid painters, photographers, and writers to capture the soul of a recovering nation. One photograph, Migrant Mother, taken by Dorothea Lange, became the face of it all. A woman's eyes, looking not forward with hope, not backward with regret, but inward, into the sheer work of survival. Hollywood played its part too. People packed into theatres to watch The Wizard of Oz, where a grey world turned to colour. Swing music drifted out of radios again. Restaurants reopened. The skyline, if you squinted just a little, seemed to be rising. GDP rose. Unemployment crept downward. The dust settled, literally and figuratively. People dared to imagine a future again. Part 5. The Lessons We Carry. The Great Depression lasted over 10 years. The Dow Jones fell 90% from its 1929 high. Over 9,000 banks failed. Unemployment peaked at nearly 25%. It was the worst economic disaster in the history of the modern world. It wasn't until 1939, when World War II began and factories roared back to life producing weapons and uniforms, that unemployment finally fell below 10%. War, of all things, finished what the New Deal had started. And the suffering of the Depression, multiplied across the globe, had fed the anger and desperation that lit the match for that war in the first place. But here's what we learned. We learned that when you let speculation outrun reality, when prices are built not on value but on hope, the fall is always waiting. We learned that easy credit without oversight is a slow-burning fuse, that when banks fail and governments do nothing, the cost is always paid by the people who can least afford it. We learned the need for a small, stable amount of inflation to keep money moving. We learnt that government has a role to play in cushioning a fall, not to reward recklessness, but to protect the innocent. We learned that deposit insurance and financial regulation aren't bureaucratic nuisances. They are, quite literally, the difference between a recession and a decade of ruin. And perhaps most simply, most humanly, we learn something about the people themselves. That even at the bottom, when the savings were gone and the crops had blown away and the soup kitchen line stretched around the block, people held on. They migrated. They lined up. They shared pieces of coal to warm each other's apartments. They slipped a few pennies to a neighbour if they were lucky enough to have them. They survived, not because they were certain things would get better, but because they had no other choice. In the end, it was greed that drove men to believe no stock price was too high, and made banks take on loans they never should have touched. And just like all bubbles, an overinflated market always meets the same ending: a painful crash. But it was also courage that rebuilt what greed had broken. That's the story of the Great Depression. And it's a story worth remembering.